Once in a while, it's nice to be given a very easy job. Today I was asked to introduce someone who needs no introduction at all, Mr. Rather, so we are just very thankful for your willingness to come here to speak with us, and on behalf of Harvard, the Kennedy School, and the Center for Public Leadership, thank you very much for coming. Now that said, a lot of you are probably wondering, who the heck is this guy? So maybe I should take a second to just introduce myself. As Jen said, I was a Zuckerman Fellow last year, and this summer I had two job offers. One was to work for a hedge fund, and one was to go to Afghanistan to be a reporter for Dan Rather, so that was a very easy decision. I know Dan because he interviewed me regarding some of my work when I was a special assistant for General Petraeus in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. I was on the show. The producer had this idea of sending me over and trying me out as a journalist, and it was a fantastic experience. So that's how we got to know each other. And I think right now I'd really just like to get right into the discussion.
Let's do it.
I'm gonna ask a few questions to start us off, and then what we really want to do is hear from you. So as it starts off and as the discussion progresses, please be thinking of questions that you can ask a little later on. So just to start off, I'll say that when I told my mother that I was going to go to Afghanistan this summer, about a week and a half before I left, she said, well, first of all, she wouldn't speak to me for a week. After my sister brokered a peace agreement between us, I said to her, don't worry, this is nothing like the job I had in Iraq. I'm going to be a journalist. I'm going with Dan Rather. They're not going to let anything happen to him. Everything will be safe. And my mother said, "Oh, you mean Gunga Dan?" That comes from Vietnam.
No, that actually comes from Afghanistan.
It comes from Afghanistan. Can you explain to us for a little bit younger?
I'll be happy to. But let me say a few things before. I will answer the question. It did not come from Vietnam. I was in Vietnam for almost a year in 1950, 65 and 66. And I was back another 4 times after that. But I'll answer the answer. But number one, I'm happy to be here, and I'm honored to be here, and humbled to be here. Number two, in the introduction to my friend Seth, we said he is a former Marine. I hope you recognize that there are no former Marines. They're Marines, period. Nobody ever leaves the Corps. I say that as a one-time enlisted man in the Marine Corps. Seth was an officer, which is one of the highest honors that our country can bestow. I have one of the shortest and least distinguished records in the whole history. I just want to make that point because, particularly for aspiring journalists, one should never be introduced as a former Marine. Number two, and I'll keep this as short as I can, but I came with a short list of things I wanted to make sure that I got done, and if I don't do them right, I haven't forgotten the question. So, that I am genuinely honored and humbled to be here, as I always am. Harvard is one of the great institutions of wisdom, knowledge, and teaching, not only in Western civilization, but in the world. And if I can be so presumptuous, I will ask a question, which I don't expect you to answer except in your own mind, which is, do you have any idea how lucky and privileged you are to be here today? And I would recommend to you keep that in mind. Number two, it's not in me, it's never in me to appear before any gathering of more than 2 or 3 people and not ask for at least for a moment to keep in mind the tremendous sacrifices that people such as Seth, you perhaps know his record in Iraq. He once actually worked for a living before going to Afghanistan, goof off for us, posing as a journalist. But I'd like to take just a moment for us to think about all of those young men and women who are sacrificing the country. So with that done, now to Gunga Dan. And not my favorite description of myself. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan around Christmas time in 1979. They had been making an effort to occupy and take over the country what you might call soft power, diplomacy, that kind of thing. It was falling apart, and so they invaded the country, a full military invasion, with the purpose of occupying the country and making it one of the Soviet satellites. I tried to go immediately. I don't always recognize a big story, but you couldn't be much of a journalist and not recognize that was a big story. But it was dead of winter in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is so mountainous, mountain passes get crowded with snow. We weren't able to go until March. And in March of 1980, with a CBS News crew and a wonderful woman from Harvard named Aidan Navy, who was our translator. She's American, but was heritage in the region, and spoke Pashto and Farsi. We walked into Afghanistan from Pakistan, now known as the territories. We walked through the Khyber Pass, and we walked in, and we were there for, I think, 18 days, and we walked out. And when I came out, this is not a complaint, there were a fair number of newspaper articles that said, one, did they really go in? Did they just use a television set somewhere in Pakistan to pose that they went? And Time magazine said, well, it's no big deal, you know, Rather's a television Hollywood kind of guy. And he went in with a $35 haircut, which was considered extreme in those days, so that expensive. And the Washington Post wrote a story, and they dumped it down. So that's where that came from.
Why is this kind of reporting important? Because maybe the story seemed obvious then, and some would say that the war in Afghanistan is an obvious story now, but it's not being widely covered. I mean, the bureaus in Baghdad and Kabul for the major news organizations are quite small. You have made a commitment on your news show, Dan Rather Reports, to do repeated efforts on Afghanistan, and yet you've almost had to explain that. I mean, I've heard you at the beginning of the show almost apologize for another show on Afghanistan because you feel it's important.
Well, I do feel it's important, and I don't feel it's necessary to apologize, but sometimes feel obliged to explain. Well, I'm pausing to make this answer as short as possible because I want to cover as much ground as we can. But when we talk about Afghanistan, I am passionate about coverage of Afghanistan, and I have been since we walked in and walked out in 1980. That I'm a walk-the-ground reporter, and I want to, it's not good enough for me, and I mean this in no self-serving way, because various journalists have various ways of carrying on their work. I want to walk the ground. I want to see and hear and smell, feel myself. And I think it's very important that somebody does it. Not everybody has to do it. Now, American journalism has changed. All of journalism has changed, but particularly American journalism has changed tremendously over just the space of your lifetimes. I would say in the space of your lifetime post-adolescence, it's changed tremendously. And at the very time we need more, better international coverage, we have less of it, and overall in the main, less quality. There are a lot of reasons for that, and we could spend the rest of the session discussing what we want. The answer to your question is that the Afghanistan war has gone on, what, 8 years? And the war in Iraq coming up soon, very near that. And with journalism and journalists, there is a fatigue factor. And it sometimes begins, and I think in this case it's begun, with journalistic organizations feeling that the public is fatigued with the war. And that's why the war, which I think should be, I think Iraq and Afghanistan should be on the front page every day. As long as we have people there, as long as we committed our blood and our treasure, as long as it's so important to our present and future, I think it would be on front page every day. That's my personal opinion. But even if one doesn't agree with that, so often it's on page 14 or 15 or 25, if indeed it is in the paper at all. As I say, there are a lot of reasons for this. Some of it has to do with what I've called the crisis in American journalism, which is to say a constant drive for profit with no bow, no salute to the public interest, and news as a public service, has gone by and large out of most of American journalism. It hasn't been that long ago where journalism was seen, commercial journalism, which is all I've ever worked in. I've never worked in anything except newspapers, wire services, radio and television, where they wanted to make a profit, they expected to make a profit, and I'm all for that. But this is the critical difference. For a long time, the tradition was, the practice was, and going back a ways, the requirement was, that yes, for example, with radio and television, you as an entrepreneur you could apply and get a license to operate the public's airways. The airways belong to we, the people. And in exchange for that, here was the deal. You said, fine, you take it, you build it into a business, you make money with it, you make a profit, but the requirement is you give something back. And what you give back is news and public affairs, community-minded broadcasting. Now, that's the model we had for a very long time. It began to disappear about 25, maybe 35 years ago, and it's accelerated since that time to where we reached the point now where very few people engaged in the business of journalism give any thought to the public interest and to news as a public service. It's gone almost completely out, with very few exceptions. And as a consequence of that, you've had the closing of overseas bureaus. A few keep that pennant waving. It's no longer a flag. Keep that pennant waving of having bureaus, having correspondents assigned to a region or an area or a capital for long enough to seat themselves in the culture, seat themselves in the story. It's almost gone out of American journalism. And so there are two basic reasons why. You asked the question, well, why does one almost have to apologize for covering Afghanistan? Why does one have to console oneself with saying, well, listen, you know, Dan's just kind of an Afghanistan freak, and that's that. So like that all. Why is coverage of the war, if in the paper at all, or if on the newscast at all, and I will say that I think television and radio are worse than newspapers about, and the excuse sometimes given is, well, you know, Dan, it's true, it's important, but it's a long way from Broadway. It's kind of a journalistic phrase. It's a hell of a long way away. We've got too many, these are all excuses. Well, we have so many problems at home, you know, people are really not interested in this anymore. It costs too much. The two most expensive things in journalism are what we used to call foreign coverage. You know, it's reached the point now where one is admonished not to use the word foreign coverage. It's supposed to be international coverage. International coverage is too expensive, and nobody gives a flying flip about it anyway. And also, if you lead with it, or you put it in your newscast to an extent, you're not going to get the demographics, much less the ratings that you deserve. And that's the way the excuses go. Now, by laying out these reasons, I am not the vice president of excuses. I don't think American journalism should make excuses. We have to recognize we are not meeting our principal role as honest brokers of information, as an important part of the checks and balances in the system, nor are we meeting our responsibility to the public interest and the public trust for this. But these are among the reasons. I have a long list of others which I'll not bore you with, why I say that American journalism is in crisis.
The New York Times and the Washington Post at one point a few years ago actually apologized for their coverage of the lead-up to the Iraq War, saying they didn't do this public service. Do you think that the failures that a lot of journalists now recognize, especially with regards to Iraq, are a symptom of these changes, or is there something else at play?
Well, I do think they're a symptom of the changes that I mentioned. And let me pause and say, whatever criticism that I speak of here, I specifically do not accept myself from this criticism, and including our failures, and they were deep and abiding failures in coverage in the lead up to the Iraq War. The things I spoke of earlier are certainly a factor. Another factor is, and there's no joy in saying this, that a certain reluctance, I hesitate to call it cowardice, it's an emotionally loaded word. The tradition of American journalists having guts and grit, having spine, has diminished to the point where there's frequently a reluctance to ask the tough question, to dig deep, to question authority, to question power. And part of that reluctance, part of that fear, keep in mind this is not an excuse. I'm trying to explain to you what has happened to us, those of us in journalism as a whole, but particularly the period leading up to the Iraq War. That among the worst things you can call anyone is, unpatriotic. And an atmosphere was created, in some cases I think deliberately created by the leadership of the country, the leadership, and like that bipartisan leadership, if you will, that if you questioned what power was saying, what the powerful was saying, what the evidence was to go to war, what the need was to go to war, you ran huge risks of having those in power and those allied with them sort of, at least metaphorically, hang a sign around you that said unpatriotic. It's very unpleasant for me to recall that period, but don't underestimate the attitude that goes, it's a war building, and you better stick with the herd. Just get in the middle with the herd, stick with the herd. You don't want to get too far out of the herd. You just want to be in the herd. And there is a price to pay for journalists who try to break away from the herd under the circumstances I just mentioned. It's never a happy time for me to talk about it, but I do think it's very important for both those in journalism, those who aspire to be in journalism, but more importantly, for the citizens as a whole, to understand the dynamic that builds in when the war drums begin to beat.
But what do you do? I mean, if you're a student here, maybe who is going to be a journalist, and you want to follow these principles, but you go to a news organization that doesn't, that's driven by profits. I mean, how do you fight that battle as a junior guy? I mean, it's quite frankly easier for you because you control your show now.
Well, it's certainly easier now, and again, I'm critical of myself. It wasn't easy at the time, but I should have been better. But to your question, to aspiring journalists, even for those who want to understand how journalism really works, as opposed to how we hope that it works, or have been led to believe that it works. For a young journalist, my late father, who worked with his back in his hands all his life, had a saying, you better know what you stand for, or you'll fall for anything. And I know that pressure. I know that I come to you, Dan Rather, former anchor, 44 years with CBS News, yammer, but I've actually worked for a living. I came up in journalism, and I worked with news directors and editors coming up. And it's always difficult. You're not going to be employed for very long if you're constantly questioning what the boss wants you to do. But you say, well, what can a young journalist do? I couldn't state it, I can't state it more strongly than find out who you are, decide who you are, what kind of journalist you want to be, dedicate yourself to doing that, and hang that out there, what I call a North Star, a navigational star. Hang that as a North Star. That's my goal. That's the kind of journalist I want to be. Now, I have to deal with the realities of, I have my first job, and I don't like the standards in this shop. And my choices here are to stick with this and sort of go along to get along, or quit, put myself out on the tough job market. Is a very, very tough decision. But I think the best advice I can give, and I grant you it's not much, is just decide what kind of journalist you want to be, hang that North Star out there, and do the best you can to constantly move toward it.
And I'm going to just ask one more question, and we'll open it up to the audience. But just moving back for a second to what we were talking about before, the blame for some of the policy decisions and perhaps mistakes that have been made over the past few years. I'd like to broaden the discussion a little bit. And I'm going to quote something from the New York Times Frank Rich wrote about the the issue of shared sacrifice with Iraq. He was talking about the relatively little attention paid to the Petraeus-Crocker hearing in New York back in April of 2008, and he said, "A home front that has not been asked to invest directly in a war, that has subcontracted it to a relatively small group of volunteers, can hardly be expected to feel it has a stake in the outcome 5 stalemated years on." Let's talk about
Well, I
that.
couldn't agree with it more. And this is my personal opinion. I try to clearly mark my personal opinion before stating it. That the mistake of leadership, and we've had this mistake made by Democratic leadership as well as Republican leadership. The mistake of leadership is to take the advice that comes to one, and the leader decides, you know what, this is really going to be nasty, this is really going to be ugly, it's going to be costly. And so what we need to do is convince the overwhelming majority of people in the country, just go on about your business. This war will be fought in your name. You don't need to worry about it. We're in charge, we know what we're doing, we have a professional force now, we have an all-volunteer professional force now. So don't worry about it. Go to the mall and shop, take your kids to school, do whatever. I think it's a critical mistake, particularly in a society such as ours, in a country such as ours, with a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy and shared sacrifice. We began losing this not too long after World War II. There's been an acceleration in this direction for more than half a century, where we're now at the point where leaders tend to do what I just described. I don't think it's too strong to say that, well, again, my opinion, I don't think we can survive, much less thrive, as a free, self-governing people with the attitude that when there's killing and dying to be done, that somebody else is going to do it for us. We can just go about our business and not worry about it. If you contrast it with World War II, the national leadership, both Republican and Democrat in World War II, the attitude that everybody has to sacrifice something, even to the point, I have a medal from President Dwight Eisenhower. It actually came from him when he was commander of U.S. forces. It's one of the things, I still have it, and it was a small medal for a waste paper campaign in Houston during the war. And looking back on it, I'm not sure the collection of waste paper ever got to anything close to the war effort. We also had to collect old rubber tires for the war effort. We also had an effort to collect aluminum. Looking back on it, I'm not sure any of that stuff ever got made into the war effort. The point was, it was designed to give even children a sense of their stake in the war. We haven't had that since then. We've had constantly, as I say, it gets worse and worse as time goes on, but don't worry about it. A few dedicated people can.
Thank you very much. All right, I'd like to open this up to the people in the audience. Yes, sir, Paul.
So if you assume that corporations are still going to be motivated primarily by the profit motive and altruism isn't going to suddenly take hold, how do you convince people to start demanding this type of news from the major broadcasters, major newspapers? Is it the politicians starting efforts to collect old tires, or is it that journalists themselves start doing stories that gain more attention? What is it that's going to drive people to demand this type of news?
Well, I'm not sure. I've spent at least the last few years trying to make this point, which I don't think most people grasp. My experience with the audience is really smart. They're much smarter than the people who program for the audience think they are. But I guess I should say, I don't know how to do what you just asked. If you find out, call me collect. I'm vitally interested in finding out how we can get the public at large to understand what's happened. For example, that by various estimates, including my own, about 80 to 85% of the mass media coverage in this country is controlled by no more than 6, my own count is 4, large, multinational, conglomerate corporations. Now let's stop right there. Remember, I'm a person who has made my living and continues to make a living in commercial journalism. I'm not anti-capitalist, I'm pro. I'm not anti-profit, I'm pro. That's what I said before. The idea of news as a public trust, and therefore the responsibility for some corner of the profit-making enterprise to be dedicated to public service in the public interest, has disappeared completely. Now, as a result of whatever your account of the control of most of the distribution system of news in the country being in the hands of very few corporations. This compares, for example, in the 1950s, there was a study done, and there were 50 some odd businesses, including some fairly large corporations, that control mass distribution of news. We're now down to, at most 6, by my count, 4. Now, it's true that I sometimes get in trouble for saying this, but it has the added advantage of being true. That all too often, big government is in bed with big partisan politics for their mutual benefit, not for the public. And this is affecting the quality of news that we get. An example would be a large corporation, international businesses of all kinds, has a news operation which is a small and ever increasingly smaller portion of its overall business. It has needs in Washington, of whomever is in power in Washington. It has some legislation it wants to get passed for its business profit-making interests. It has some legislation it wants to stop. It has all kinds of regulatory issues. They want more regulation for some things and less regulation for others. Now, these corporations spend tremendous amounts of money trying to get what they want out of Washington. Increasingly, what's developed is that the political entity, and again, this is a bipartisan thing, the political entity as well, you're asking me on the one hand to help you with regulations or legislation. On the other hand, you send these damn reporters out here who are trying to expose illegal or unethical business practices. There's a conflict here. Now, the conflict has always been there, but it's grown tremendously. And I don't think enough attention is being paid, my personal opinion, to how we deal with this. It's unhealthy to have big business in bed with big partisan politics and influencing the news as much as it does. As to your question, the first thing is to be aware. You said, what can be done? First thing is to be aware. The second thing is to be heard.
Hi there, Swanee. It's good to see you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
You are known, I'm going to introduce a more hopeful topic here. You're known.
We could use it.
Yeah, I know. You're known for finding the untold story. And recently you've talked about the role of women leaders in situations that otherwise seem rather desperate to us as we look at our role in foreign affairs. Could you say more about your ruminations there?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate you using the word ruminations. That I consider to be, consider the oppression of women to be a leading moral challenge of the 21st century. In somewhat the same way that slavery became the leading moral challenge of the 19th century, lapsing on into the 20th century. I believe this is the case of what's happening to women worldwide today. And that's number one. Number two, I have spoken specifically about some places, including Afghanistan. I have yet to have this argument accepted on a widespread basis. But I think our best hope for accomplishing what we seek to accomplish in Afghanistan, even if you accept the minimum hope for accomplishing in Afghanistan, depends to a very large degree on the women in Afghanistan. That by and large, women don't want the Taliban to return in Afghanistan because they experienced what it really was. And there are, of course, exceptions to this, particularly when you get deep into rural areas. But I don't think enough attention has been paid in Afghanistan to paid, and there have been at least small increases, but such things as educating women in Afghanistan, bringing women into leadership positions in Afghanistan, listening to women in Afghanistan. If you go to a meeting, diplomatic or military, of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, overwhelmingly, the people in the room are going to be men. Occasionally there may be a woman, but overwhelmingly they're going to be men. And I use Afghanistan just an example. Everything from the sex trade to health issues to the opportunity for leadership positions on a worldwide basis that I consider to be a leading moral challenge of the 21st century.
Yes, ma'am?
Good afternoon. Sorry, we're pointing at you?
Yes.
I had a question, and you mentioned this a little bit. You mentioned the different forms of journalism and the different ways that we're getting our news these days, things from YouTube to iReporters to these unofficial journalists. And it seems like in some areas, as we saw recently in Iran, this was the only way that we got information. And I was just wondering, as someone who's been in journalism for so long, what are your thoughts on this new form of getting information from an international context, especially as we lose some of the more established ways of information dissemination?
Well, clearly we're in what some of the religious leaders call an interregnum in terms of getting information to the public, journalism, which is my passion. Interregnum being the old order is gone, the new order is not yet in place. We're still finding our way. Everything from the internet, say, you mentioned YouTube, Twitter, go right down the list. I can be accused of being old school. I am old school in the sense I believe in the core values. The internet has plenty of things on it that are not journalism. Some good, some bad, some hard to tell. But good journalism is good journalism, whatever the delivery system is. And good journalism begins with a commitment to quality and use of integrity, begins with a commitment to accuracy and fairness. That doesn't change. It didn't change when we went from newspapers to the additional advantage of radio. It didn't change when we went from radio and newspapers to television. And it isn't changing now with all of these new kinds of platforms for journalism. I see one problem, and that is not everything on the internet is journalism. Not nearly everything on the internet. Not Twitter, it can be a platform for journalism, but it's also a platform for gossip and just sort of an aimed, pretty conversation. Same with YouTube. You see the point. The good journalism is good journalism, whatever the delivery system is. So as we move from this interregnum, as we move from the old order to whatever the new order of things is going to be, which I think there's vast opportunity out there for the spread of really good journalism. Whatever it's going to be, the basics don't change. The fundamentals remain the same.
Do you think good journalism is going to survive this change? I mean, we're going to see Watergate-style, really, really deep reporting in the future?
Well, I am an optimist by experience and by nature, and I think the answer is yes. I am concerned, as I said before, about the crisis period we're going through now. And you hit a very important point. That the price of freedom is vigilance, and the vigilance in a free society such as ours, an important part of it is free and independent, truly independent, fiercely independent when necessary journalism as a part of what we all learned in this country in the 7th grade, part of our system of checks and balances. Journalism at its best, one of its key roles is to be a check on power. And investigative journalism, which is the most difficult and the most expensive, and also the most susceptible to the kind of pressures we talked about with the earlier question of big government and big partisan political operations, people and movements, exerting pressure, usually behind the scenes, to squash investigative journalists. Say, listen, we have the 11 o'clock news. Now, what I want you to do in the 11 o'clock news, put this in quotation, what I want you to do in the 11 o'clock news is I want you to get young viewers, that's your demographic, which is the most important sales point now, and I want you to get the ratings. And I don't think you do that by sniffing around on whether the mayor made a special deal with the zoning ordinance to benefit his property on the edge of town, or that someone in Washington is benefiting from legislation. The kind of investigative reporting, which is what I call vertical reporting. There is the broad, general, horizontal reporting, which is most of what we see. But the deep digging vertical reporting, the kind of reporting that takes the attitude, okay, that's what they say is going on, now let me get busy and find out what's really going on, is, I'm sorry to say, going out of fashion, badly out of fashion. And one reason is that the people who control, particularly most of our mass diffusion systems, don't want it. They don't want it because it costs more money. They don't want it because it's at odds with other things that they want to achieve, such as regulatory help, legislative help. But I am an optimist about it. And I think right now there are a few journalistic enterprises and a few journalists who are keeping a very low and flickering flame of investigative journalism there. If the public doesn't grow to appreciate investigative journalism, the kind of journalism we were just talking about, the kind of journalism that goes to Watergate, the kind of journalism that exposes malfeasance and corruption, if the public doesn't become more aware of the need for it, speak up for it, yet demand it, then I can see that what I've described as small, wavering little flame going out. But I don't think that's going to happen. I have more confidence in the country and more confidence in the people in the country. We're in a bad phase for this now. That if you work at a local television or radio station and you come into your news director and say, you know, I have a tip or I have a suspicion about some corruption. It's going to take me a while to get at it. I need some time to work on it. The good person who is that news director or station manager is very likely going to say, you know, Jim, you spent too much time listening to Dan Rather. You spent too much time listening to your journalism profession. Just go out. We need 4 stories today. I need you to come in before 5:30 tonight with 4 stories. And what we have is we have a mall opening on the southwest side. We have a mayor's news conference at 12 o'clock. We hopefully will have a fire before the day is out. And if we're really lucky, we'll have some shootout. That's what we need. And that conversation goes on every day in almost every newsroom.
Seth, excuse me.
Yeah.
We have
Just have a
about
couple
5 more
time.
minutes,
All
so
right.
just time for one more question.
All right, Jake?
Thanks. One of the things I just wanted to ask about is obviously it's becoming even more dangerous to do journalism in war zones, and thinking of Daniel Pearl and Jill Carroll and some of these other hostage cases. One of the most recent ones, David Rode, reporter from the New York Times. The New York Times kept that quiet for 4 months, and allegedly they were also willing to pay $5 million to secure his release. They didn't have to do that, but they were willing to do that. Are news organizations justified, or how should they handle cases like that, and is it okay for them to have a double standard as far as how they might treat their own reporters and keeping that quiet and being willing to pay, or how they might treat somebody who's connected to an NGO or the U.S. military?
I think I understand the question, and I think I understand the question behind the question. While not accepting the double standard, I do believe in news organizations taking care of their people. That the best of journalism organizations, and we had it at CBS News when I was there, is a version of what the Marines have. We leave nobody behind. We don't leave anybody out there. And I'm not going to pass judgment on anybody in individual cases about what they've done and haven't done to get their people out. War coverage is dangerous. I think in the public mind, the danger of being in a war zone, they may equate what journalists do pretty much what military people do. Let me make it explicitly clear that while being a combat correspondent, being in a war zone as a journalist is dangerous, it's not nearly as dangerous as those we have to fight for. And we dispel that right away. Now, any journalist worthy of the name who seeks to be a world-class reporter takes the attitude that, which I take, which in some ways, on some days, danger is my business. That if you're going to be an honest broker of information, if you're going to find out what's going on, what's really going on, you have to go. And that does mean you're going to danger. But never confuse no one's mind. You're doing is as dangerous as people that think the war. But it goes with the territory. You understand what the risks are, and you take the risks, and you hope the Home Office, whatever that Home Office, whether it's the New York Times or the Giddings Oil Driller newspaper, will back you up and do whatever they can to get you out and get in trouble. Listen, you've been terrific here. I'm sorry we don't have longer, and I'm sorry I talked some of these questions to death. My apologies for that. Thank you very much for having me.